Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia, and welcome to my home studio, or one of two of them actually. We have now lived this home for just over 3 weeks by God's grace, and it's actually the spiciest home we have ever had as a family. So, the topic of this video is the case of the late Mr. Karl Linnas, an alleged Nazi war criminal who had, according to the charges against him, participated in crimes against humanity, including the forcible deportation of Jews from Estonia, his native land, which is a small republic on the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland, which is the eastern arm of the Baltic Sea, and actually, therefore, Estonia is the southern neighbor of my distant native land, Finland, in northern Europe. So, in the summer of 1941, around July of that year, the Germans had occupied, in July and early August 1941, I believe, uh, the advancing Germans had occupied Estonia, and they had established a wartime administration there, military administration, and had encouraged many Estonians to participate in the Nazi war effort, especially the young and able-bodied and able-minded Estonian men. And thousands of Estonians did collaborate with the Germans, I assume in most cases out of either the fear of punishment, whether it be physical punishment like beating and other forms of torture, or imprisonment, or deportation, especially in the cases of those who had either Jewish or Slavic background, ethnic or racial background, or then execution. Or then also another option would be to flee to the Estonian forests and hide there as a fugitive or as a partisan, which of course was a very precarious form of resistance. In Estonia, by the way, this is just an aside, as in the other two Baltic republics of Northern and Eastern Europe, in Latvia and Lithuania, especially in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, there was a strong resistance movement called the Forest Brothers. And sporadically, usually single individuals belonging to the Forest Brothers were still found after that time. One of the last ones to be found during the Cold War was Mr. August Sabe in southeastern Estonia, who probably drowned himself rather than surrender to the Soviet agents in August 1978. But now to get back to Mr. Linnas. So he had collaborated allegedly with the Nazi war criminals in Estonia during that country's German occupation between 1941 and 1944. And after the Second World War, he and like millions of other Europeans had immigrated, and millions of other people from different regions and continents of the earth had immigrated to the United States and had worked there as a land surveyor. And then over the course of the 1980s, he had come under suspicion of having participated in these war crimes, which eventually led to his deportation in late April 1987, and reportedly he tried to physically resist the authorities who were taking them on board the airplane at the Los Angeles International Airport. But in he went nevertheless, and he arrived to the Soviet Union, but just 2.5 months later, in early July, actually in very early July 1987, he died of multiple illnesses in a hospital in Leningrad, which was then the name of St. Petersburg in what was then the Soviet Union. Now, of course, it's the Russian Federation. So let's look at this case more closely. So according to his brief English language Wikipedia biography, he was born in Tartu, which is the main city of southern Estonia, on August the 6th, 1919, and died in Leningrad on July the 2nd, 1987, aged 67. So he actually had been sentenced to death during the Holocaust trials in the Soviet Socialist Republic of Estonia in 1961 to 1962. And he was tried in absentia, or in absence, and sentenced to death by a Soviet court in 1962 on charges that during the German occupation between 1941 and 1943, he had been the commander of a Nazi concentration camp in Tartu and had personally shot innocent civilians, men, women, and children. Okay, so I'm correcting what I said in my introduction to this video. After the Soviet armies forced the Germans out of Estonia by the autumn of 1944, Linnas fought with the German army and was wounded in 1944. After that, he stayed in a displaced persons camp in Germany until he immigrated to the United States in 1951. So Mr. Linnas worked indeed as a land surveyor and lived in Green Lawn, New York State, or New York City. Let's check. Yeah, it's actually a part of New York City. Or the greater New York City region, because it's a hamlet or small village and census-designated place in Suffolk County, New York, and it's located on Long Island in the town of Huntington. So I was able to live as a private citizen until 1979, when US immigration officials charged him with making false statements to gain entry to the United States. As a result, the Office of Special Investigations of the US Justice Department prosecuted him and accordingly, in 1981, the Federal District Court in Westbury, New York, stripped him or deprived him of his US citizenship because he had lied to immigration officials 30 years earlier about his Nazi past. He did appeal the ruling, but in 1986, a federal appeals court upheld the order for his deportation. It ruled that the evidence against the defendant was overwhelming and largely uncontroverted. And on April the 20th, 1987, the US Supreme Court refused to hear his final appeal, and then he was forced by federal officials to board an airplane that took him to the Soviet Union. He became the second formerly naturalized American to be, or American citizen, in other words, a non-native born citizen of the United States, to be deported to the Soviet Union after Fyodorenko, whose execution took place incidentally in 1987, so the same year when Mr. Linnas was deported to the Soviet Union and passed away there. Probably the most controversial case of a European immigrant having been naturalized as a US citizen and being later accused of having participated in the Holocaust was Mr. Ivan or John Demjanjuk, who fought his deportation and his conviction for having participated in the Holocaust, and claimed that he had been confused with another man named Ivan or John in the same concentration camp. And eventually he died in detention in a German nursing home, if I remember correctly, in 2012. Now, even the oldest Nazi criminals are about 100 years. I'm sorry, even the youngest Nazi criminals who are still alive are about 100 years old. Recently, actually earlier this year, a 100-year-old man, I believe in Germany, was charged with having participated in the Holocaust. Well, given the fact that they are extremely old and they are likely to pass away in any case in the near future, it's more likely that they will be held in a form of house arrest or home confinement. Shortly after Mr. Linnas' death, it was discovered that the Soviet Union had actually commuted his death sentence to life in prison because of his poor health. He had reportedly been suffering from heart disease, circulatory problems, internal hemorrhaging, and cirrhosis of the liver shortly before his death. And here's the abstract or summary of a research paper on his case written by Jerome S. Legge Jr., entitled The Karl Linnas Deportation Case, the Office of Special Investigations and American Ethnic Politics. It appeared in the journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Volume 24, Issue 1 in the spring 2010 edition on pages 26 to 55. So here is the brief abstract of this research paper. The deportation case against Karl Linnas, an Estonian war criminal who entered the United States in 1951 through the Displaced Persons Act, highlighted tensions between American politics and the American legal system. Linnas became a citizen, meaning a US citizen, in 1960, but in 1962, the Soviet Union tried him in absentia and sentenced him to death for crimes he committed in the Tartu concentration camp. In 1981, the US Department of Justice's new Office of Special Investigations initiated denaturalization hearings against Linnas. After he had exhausted the prolonged appeals process, Linnas was deported to Soviet Estonia in 1987, and he died then in prison. Yeah, technically, he didn't die in Soviet Estonia, but in the Russian Federated Soviet Socialist Republic, because he died in what was then called Leningrad and what is now again called St. Petersburg. The case provoked strong challenges by members of the Baltic American community, many of whom perceived it as a test of the US policy of non-recognition of the Soviet annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And then here is, interestingly enough, a research paper. Of course, I'm just going to read bits and pieces of it, written by Mr. Meelis Maripuu, an Estonian academician, entitled Cold War Show Trials in Estonia, Justice and Propaganda in the Balance. I'll save it. This is an interesting article. Hope that I will be able to save it. Because a part of the communist propaganda during the Cold War, even during the Second World War, was that they had liberated, or they were about to liberate, Eastern Europe, including the Baltic countries, from the fascists. They basically equated the fascists and Nazis, even though on a closer examination, while the fascists and Nazis were both far rightists, they were not exactly the same in ideology or in practice. So once again, the abstract or summary, the paper demonstrates how Soviet judicial institutions and the prosecution of crimes internationally not subject to statutes of limitations, in other words, that there would be crimes that would be considered outdated, or would have been considered outdated. as a whole were used to achieve the political aims of the Soviet regime. More specifically, the author considers show trials held in the occupied Baltic countries, meaning Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, in the early 1960s, highlighting their general organizational scheme, domestic and foreign policy aims, propaganda media coverage, manipulation of witnesses, and discrediting of expatriate circles. And of course, the wider international context was that around that time, the so called thaw, in other words, the period of temporary easing of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States and quite many of their allies, was about to end, cool down. There had been that peace conference or similar diplomatic conference in Paris in 1960, which had failed. And then following the inauguration of the narrowly and controversially or disputedly even elected new US President John Kennedy in January 1961, only 4.5 months later, in early June 1961, there was a stormy summit between him and the Soviet dictator, General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Mr. Nikita Khrushchev. And then after that, Kennedy commented that there would be, figuratively speaking, a cold winter ahead, and that he hoped that the Americans' nerves would be tough enough. Already under 3 months into his term, that is in early or mid, anyway, before April the 20th, 1961, there had been a failed attempt by a few thousand Cuban Americans to invade their home island, native island in the Caribbean, and to overthrow the communist government of dictator Fidel Castro. As we know, it failed miserably. President Kennedy acknowledged the failure and took, at least officially, full responsibility for it, and he even invited his predecessor, the retired US President Dwight Eisenhower, to confer with him privately, because actually this operation had been planned in the final months of the Eisenhower administration, but Kennedy had, albeit reluctantly, given the go-ahead, the approval to the operation. And then slightly over 2 months after the disastrous Vienna summit, on August the 13th, 1961, incidentally, it was a Sunday, thousands of East German soldiers closed the border between East Berlin and West Berlin with barbed wire, and then thousands of East German workers were ordered to start building a high and solid brick wall. Officially, it was designed as a so-called anti-fascist protective rampart, antifaschistischer Schutzwall, but in practice it was designed to halt, or at least to radically reduce the number of young people and adults, including many students, teachers, engineers, scientists, lawyers, and skilled workers, to West Germany and several other Western democracies from East Germany. East Germany, actually, during its first almost 12 years of existence, it had officially been established in October 1949, had already lost at least hundreds of thousands, if not even over 1 million of its citizens, because, or other inhabitants as well, because obviously they voted with their feet. While the border between the two Germanys was still fairly open, especially before or until 1952, it was easy to cross it even by walking. But then progressively it became more and more guarded. But until August 1961, or early August 1961, it was still possible for those East Germans who wished to leave the country to simply cross the border between East Berlin and West Berlin. Yes, they could have been forced to pay a heavy exit tax. Yes, many of them probably were forced to leave most of their property in East Germany, but at least they could escape with their lives and their clothing and whatever they could pack into their suitcases. And then, as an aside, in Northern Europe, involving actually Finland and the Soviet Union, there was the so-called note crisis. In other words, on October the 30th, 1961, incidentally, when the Finnish president, the longest-serving Finnish president, Dr. Urho Kekkonen, was still visiting the United States after a brief stopover in Canada, the Soviet government sent a note or formal letter to the Finnish government claiming that militarism and neo-Nazism had considerably been strengthened in West Germany, and therefore, in accordance with the friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance agreement, which Finland and the Soviet Union had signed for the first time in April 1948, it was important to have consultations on the alleged threat of a West German invasion, coupled with its at least some of its allies, either of Finland or of the Soviet Union through the Finnish territory. And in the decades since, quite many Finns who are interested in these historical issues, or have been, many of them have passed away already by now or have lost their interest, but there are still some who argue that the late President Kekkonen ordered that note or requested it from the Soviet Union. And then there are those who claim that it came as a surprise, although there are quite few in number. Then there are those similar to my position that Kekkonen probably knew already half a year earlier, in the spring of 1961, of the possibility or of the probability that this note was sent, but there is no fully conclusive evidence that he actually requested a note to be sent. As it turned out, it did at least partially help him to easily defeat his three left-wing opponents after his center-right opponent, the former Chancellor of Justice or Attorney General of Finland, not the Justice Minister, however, Mr. Olavi Honka, ended his candidacy in the interests of the fatherland in late November 1961. But in any case, Kekkonen was re-elected with almost 2/3 of the votes in the Electoral College in February 1962, and he went on to get re-elected still in 1968, in 1973 through a so-called exceptional law, and even in 1978. He only then announced his decision to retire because of failing health, arterial sclerosis, failing eyesight, and so forth in October 1981, and then officially retired as the 8th Finnish president in January 1982. And then in 1962, in October of that year, as we know, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when for approximately 2 weeks, the Earth hung on the brink of a nuclear war. At issue was the fact that various US surveillance, or in effect spy airplanes, had observed and photographed a number of Soviet ships who were carrying nuclear weapons to Cuba, and they had actually even taken aerial photographs of those nuclear power plants in Cuba. And President Kennedy made a sternly worded televised speech in October 1962, threatening to force the Soviet warships to retreat, or Soviet cargo ships to retreat and not reach Cuba unless the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the nuclear weapons. Interestingly enough, for all his bullying of Kennedy over a year earlier in the Vienna summit, it was Mr. Khrushchev who gave up. So it seems that even he had a soft spot in his heart. So he agreed to withdraw the Soviet nuclear weapons from Cuba, and then the United States, in return, agreed not to arm Turkey, one of its NATO allies, with more nuclear weapons or something similar. Whether this episode had any effect on General Secretary Khrushchev's fall from power 2 years later, in October 1964, when a so-called troika or trio in Russian replaced him. In other words, Mr. Leonid Brezhnev became the general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party and the chairperson of the Politburo, or its political office, which was like an inner cabinet, inner government of the Soviet Union during the Soviet times. And he became, in practice, the dictator of the Soviet Union, but he nominally shared his power with President Nikolai Podgorny, who was simply the highest presiding officer of the Supreme Soviet, the Soviet Federal Parliament, and then Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin. So now you understand the context more of these show trials. So introduction, I'm just going to read bits and pieces of this paper. Starting in 1960, a wave of show trials of persons accused of Nazi crimes, including participation in the Holocaust, rippled through the Soviet bloc as part of the Cold War. These trials had several important features in common. From the end of World War II, that is from 1945 until the mid-1950s, so roughly for a decade, political show trials took place in countries under the control of the Soviet Union. And similar show trials probably were also held here in Asia, especially in China itself and North Korea. After all, the Chinese communists had fully defeated the nationalists, or the Kuomintang or Kuomintang party, thousands of whose members fled, directed by General Chiang Kai-shek, who had been officially China's head of state since 1928, fled to the island of Formosa, or Formosa, meaning beautiful in Portuguese, because it had been a Portuguese colony earlier, and it was then renamed Taiwan, or the Republic of China. And until today, the Communist Chinese government refuses to recognize Taiwan as an independent country, and officially refuses to have diplomatic relations with those relatively few countries which officially recognize Taiwan. And its recent posturing means, like these military exercises, means that the Communist Chinese government still, at least in principle, is intent on either reoccupying Taiwan and annexing it, or at least on isolating it militarily, politically, strategically, and otherwise, and well, economically. One of the motivations, of course, is an economic one, because Taiwan is at least over twice as rich as the mainland China, as measured by its gross domestic product per capita, as measured by purchasing power capita figures, or purchasing power parity figures. And then a strategic reason, because after all, Taiwan is the northern neighbor of, guess which country? The Philippines, the country where I have been living now, including my 2 summer holidays in Finland, for almost 8 years. The wider context is that China has recently concluded a kind of security agreement with Solomon Islands, one of the so-called native Oceanian countries. So one of the countries in Oceania that have either Polynesian, Melanesian, or other native Oceanian majority. And Australia, which is a kind of regional great power in Oceania, containing over half of its population, has voiced its opposition to this nearing of relations or rapprochement between China and the Solomon Islands. And it's against this background that it's easy to understand why now the former Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who was then the leader of the Liberal Party of Australia, concluded in September 2021 an agreement with the United States and Britain to build nuclear submarines to help Australia defend itself. But we go on. Political show trials, in other words, their verdicts were already decided, but for propaganda purposes, they still took place. So in all cases, it was already decided that the defendants would be condemned either to death or to a long imprisonment or long forced labor. Whether they actually were guilty or not, that was immaterial. Such show trials, of course, are one of the many crucial differences between genuine democracies and dictatorships, whether those dictatorships are totalitarian dictatorships, as were the communist countries during the Cold War and still technically are up to this day, although the strictest one by far of them is North Korea. But also they were held under the fascist and Nazi regimes and have been held by a number of authoritarian dictatorships as well. Even though the authoritarian dictatorships don't go as far as do the totalitarian dictatorships in coercing and crushing the civil rights and freedoms of their inhabitants. In which communists and socialists, former comrades in arms of the Soviets, were convicted. Yes, also them, in addition to the former ruling elites of those countries in the Baltic and Eastern Europe, which were conquered by the Soviet Union effectively by domestic communists between 1944 and 1949. Actually, the only Eastern European country that was officially a non-communist country until 1989 or so, or 1991, was Greece in southeastern Europe. So the former ruling elites were, of course, a diverse group ranging from the far right to the moderate liberals and centrists, were convicted and even sentenced to death with the aim of consolidating or making more powerful Soviet control. Alongside the direct consolidation of power, these trials played, of course, an important role in the Cold War propaganda battle, because after all, they were both filmed and then presented, of course, in greatly edited versions as propaganda movies, and then photographed and, of course, even recorded. And we could even say, this thought just came into my mind, that they were, to some extent, imitations of the Nuremberg trials. The most famous one of which lasted from November 1945 until the start of October 1946, and led to the execution by hanging of 10 Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg, the Allied occupied Germany. And then in the decades since that, those trials and similar ones were held in Japan, where a number of the former Japanese army officers and political leaders, most notably former General and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were executed, also by hanging. where they were meant to demonstrate the immutability of the Soviet regime. So in other words, the Soviet regime would not be silenced and would not change. The trials were held in classic Stalinist style, with arrest and the bringing of charges generally guaranteeing a conviction. Two factors worked together to make contemporary historians accept unquestioningly the results of Soviet show trials concerning World War II. The importance of the Holocaust, meaning the mass murder of approximately 6 million European Jews, mostly between 1942 and 1945, and mostly as far as the pre-World War II borders were concerned, in Germany and Poland, in numerous extermination and concentration camps, although, of course, on a minor scale, the Holocaust-related killings had already begun around the time of the Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, where a number of Jewish shops and synagogues had been looted throughout Germany, and over 90 Jews had been killed. And just before that, Germany had ordered the deportation of thousands of Jews to Poland, and Poland had for several months then after that refused to allow them to settle in Poland, and it was only around the spring of 1939, just a few months before the European battles of the Second World War had begun, that at last Poland had decided to give most of them political asylums. And then the Holocaust had started to intensify in June and July 1941, when Germany allied in that section of the Eastern Front with Italy, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. The largest contingents of non-German soldiers coming from Romania, I believe, had begun to summarily execute groups of Jewish civilians in the western regions of the Soviet Union. But then at the end of January 1942, the Wannsee conference was held in Berlin, the German capital, to prepare the methods for the, as they, in their Nazi criminal and racist, deplorable, horrible ideology, called it the final solution to the Jewish problem in Europe. So this involved the mass deportation of Jews from those European countries which were either directly or indirectly controlled by the Germans, to those extermination and concentration camps which were to be established inside the pre-World War II borders of Germany and Poland, for the most part, although a number of concentration camps were established elsewhere in Europe. And tragically enough, even Finland had a number of such camps in that part of the Soviet East Karelia, which it occupied from 1941 to 1944, even though they were by no means as brutal as were the Nazi-controlled concentration and especially extermination camps. Thousands of Russian and other non-Finnish and non-Finnish civilians did perish in those camps because of, for example, the bitter cold in the wintertime, and then starvation and bad food, and to some extent bad treatment like beatings on the part of Finnish guards and so forth. And because at the time when the European battles of the Second World War broke out in September 1939, when Germany attacked Poland, there were some 11 to 12 million Jews living in Europe. This meant that approximately half of Europe's Jewish population was more or less systematically slaughtered. We, of course, know the methods: overwork, beatings, summary executions, especially when there were cases of riots by prisoners, those concentration camp prisoners, or then cases of escape. A few or some managed to escape, actually. And most notoriously, the gas chambers, where, I mean, in The most notorious one of the concentration camps, or one of the most notorious ones, the Auschwitz concentration camp in or near Oświęcim in southern Poland, uh, according to the testimony of one of the Nazi criminals, Rudolf Höss, not to be confused with Rudolf Hess. Some 2.5 million human beings were gassed to death in Auschwitz alone. So the importance of the Holocaust in today's world and the inaccessibility of relevant archives of the Soviet state security services, which would have shed light on the motives for launching these trials. I have to actually just wonder, when was this published? Well, I see one date, February the 7th, 2014, so it must have been published in or after 2014. Due to the archival restrictions, an assessment of these cases is often only possible by drawing conclusions from and/or making comparisons with similar trials. The show trials of Nazi criminals staged by Soviet authorities in Estonia in the 1960s are the focus of the following article. So after World War II, which had lasted here in Asia for 8 years, dating back to July 1937, when Japan had invaded the war-torn China, as one of the huge steps forward toward establishing a huge Asian Oceanian empire in the Pacific region of the Earth. And in Europe, it had lasted for almost 6 years, from September 1939 to May 1945. The world faced questions of penalizing war criminals, after all, because there were multiple genocides had been multiple genocides during the Second World War. The Holocaust obviously was the most documented one, the most notorious one, but there were millions of Slavic people who were slaughtered more or less systematically in Europe, especially Russians, Belarusians or White Russians, and Ukrainians, but also Poles and Yugoslavs, such as Slovenes, Croats, Bosnians, and Serbs. And then there had been, going on since 1935, genocide of the Romani or Gypsy minority of Germany, called Poraimos or Porraimos, in which, according to the estimates, between hundreds of thousands or even up to 2 million Romas were murdered. And then here in Asia, many Filipinos, Koreans, Chinese, Thais, Laotians, and Burmese, Indonesians, Malaysians were killed, and also a number of Oceanians, mostly native Oceanians like Polynesians and Melanesians, were killed. And in Africa, there were a number of people from different ethnic groups and tribes who were killed, mostly in northern and eastern Africa. While in the First World War, the only major mass genocide was that of the Armenians, perpetrated by the Ottoman Turks, and during that genocide, between 1 and 2 million Armenians died in the Middle East. The development of international justice had made great strides since World War I. The earlier Hague and Geneva Conventions were considered customary international law by World War II, regardless of whether a country had ratified a particular convention. So the concept of universal human rights was beginning to emerge, and that, of course, is one of the founding principles of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, similar declarations had been made earlier, for example, in the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, although originally it meant basically only the rights of white people, especially white men. And similarly, at the start of the Great French Revolution, or soon after it, in August 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And then already in the constitutions of many of those countries that had either genuinely or superficially adopted a democratic form of government. Massive numbers of war crimes against civilians and prisoners of war were committed, especially on the Eastern Front, meaning the European Eastern Front in the war between the Soviet Union and Germany, also known as the Operation Barbarossa, because it was Germany who invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. In 1944, the Polish-American lawyer Raphael Lemkin introduced the term genocide, and it was actually nicknamed ethnic cleansing during the Yugoslav civil wars in the 1990s. My generation of people, I was born in 1972, and even many of the people born in the 1980s remember those civil wars well, if they were following them in the international mass media as I was, among many others, millions of others. In the sense of the murder of a people. As a result of political agreements, this term entered into circulation in the context of World War II, primarily in connection with the killing of Jews. So I'll skip several paragraphs. An embellished image of this trial developed over the decades of the Cold War, while largely ignoring the Soviet Union's experiences in holding staged political show trials. The subsequent Nuremberg trials held by the United States, occupying authorities in 1946 to 1949 were conducted in the spirit of the principles of Nuremberg, relying on Control Council Law Number 10 of the Allied countries occupying Germany. At the same time, the occupying Allied countries held numerous trials of lower-level accused persons in Germany's occupation zones on the basis of military tribunals from their own countries. In these and subsequent years, thousands of citizens of, we should have the former Nazi Germany and countries that it had occupied or that it had cooperated with, were tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity in various countries based on domestic laws and procedures. Under the conditions of the emerging Cold War, because it began sometime between September 1945, when a young Soviet-born clerk of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, Canada's capital, that is in North America, Mr. Igor Guzenko, who had already been notified by one of his superiors in the embassy that he would rather soon be sent back to the Soviet Union, and because he had become disgusted with communism and didn't want to return there, he took, with his own permission, well, technically stole, although his purpose was to expose the huge amount of espionage that the Soviet Union was conducting in North America alone. There were no less than 20 spies working for the Soviet Union in Canada alone, despite the fact that Canada had tried to have friendly relations with the Soviet Union and had been one of its allies during the Second World War, alongside, for example, Britain and the United States. And then also when Mr. Guzenko was questioned later that fall or autumn, it was discovered that there were multiple Soviet spies or spies working for the Soviet Union also in the United States. Some historians and lay people consider this to have been the start of the Cold War, and arguably it could have been. Then obviously the fact that by 1946 the Soviet Union already was firmly under control of East Germany, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, whether directly or indirectly, and then the domestic communists were controlling Albania and Yugoslavia, and then under contention were still the political controls of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Both of those countries would fall to the communist sphere of control by 1948. The Cold War was emerging. In March 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, the United States, the British opposition leader and former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, although he would still serve as Prime Minister of Britain between 1951 and 1955, held his famous and long speech called Sinews of Peace, also known as the Iron Curtain speech, in which he famously declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." And then later on, during the Cold War, many people would speak of the bamboo curtain dividing the communist and non-communist countries of Asia, especially in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. Why bamboo? Because bamboos grow in many countries of Eastern and Southeastern Asia, and especially referred to the borderlines between China and its non-communist neighbors in Asia. And by March 1947, when the US President Harry Truman announced in a major speech to the US Congress his decision to ask the Congress to give military assistance to Greece and Turkey, which were fighting against the threat of communist takeover, especially Greece, which had a brutal civil war going on. And he said that he believed that it had to be the policy of the United States to assist the peoples who were being threatened by revolts and invasions. So by that time, at the latest, the Cold War began, and it ended with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in December 1991. Although in the Malta summit in late 1989, already the US and Soviet presidents, George Bush Sr. and Mikhail Gorbachev, had declared the Cold War to be over. So the Cold War lasted over 4 decades. The trial of Nazi criminals became ever more politicized. The Nuremberg trial itself was political by its nature, in the sense that only the major Allied powers, meaning the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, appointed their judges. There were no neutral countries' judges, no Swedish, Swiss, Portuguese, Irish, or Spanish judges, for example, let alone Latin American judges, let alone I'm not sure if there were any officially neutral countries in Africa out of the few ones that were independent back then, and so forth. Regardless of its legal basis, and thus could easily be criticized from this aspect, regardless of the fact that, yes, most of those men who were on trial had committed horrible crimes. Most of the war criminals who were on trial were definitely grossly guilty of crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. Germany reunified in October 1990, and the Federal Republic of Germany could theoretically review the verdicts of the Nuremberg trials. But this is unlikely given contemporary political, legal, and moral developments. So regardless of their shortcomings, the Nuremberg trials have become an iconic landmark in the evolution of modern international criminal justice, or Völkerstrafrecht in German. So cooperation across the Iron Curtain in proving the guilt of Nazi criminals was slow to develop, not the least because of the tense relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the ideological competition which took place in politics, of course, in diplomacy, um, in the arms race, um, in economics, and even in culture, including sports and education, and even partly in the religious realm, in the sense that um, the Western, or many Western democracies, accused, and rightly so, many communist dictatorships of having trampled on the rights of their religious minorities, including those who profess to be Christians or Jews. And then the standard Soviet and other communist countries' response was, do not interfere with our internal affairs. We have freedom of religion. Those people are free to worship God or other deities in whom they believe in their churches or other places of worship and in their homes, but we do not allow religious propaganda. If information was exchanged, it was still marked by palpable mistrust and suspicions regarding the authenticity of the other side's evidence. And then, trials of Nazi crimes in the Soviet Union. The first political show trials were held during the war in 1943 in the Soviet Union. This was actually news to me. Based on the work of these commissions, in other words, extraordinary state commissions, ESC, with representatives in even the smallest administrative units in territories which had been liberated from German rule and recaptured by the Soviet armies. Immediately after the Soviet occupation resumed in Estonia in October 1944, the corresponding regional commission was also set to work in Estonia, and it was supposed to complete its investigation within 2 weeks, but that, of course, was totally impossible. There simply were not enough people or other actors, there were not enough resources available to thoroughly and objectively ascertain the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the preceding 4 years, dating back to June 1940, when Estonia, alongside Latvia and Lithuania, had been forcibly occupied by the Soviet Union, or totally occupied. They had been partly occupied since late September and early October 1939, when, as a result of the coerced so-called friendship and cooperation agreements, they had been forced to allow thousands of Soviet troops to peacefully enter their territories and proceed to their naval and other military bases. At that time, it was important for the Soviet Union to present to the world as many Soviet citizens as possible who perished at the hands of the German side, even if they were not really Soviet citizens, and to establish the greatest sufferer image with an eye to dividing up the spoils after victory. So according to the Russian Federal Security Services data or information, over 320,000 local residents were arrested in the Soviet Union from 1943 to 1953. And according to the available information, over 5,000 people were arrested in Estonia already in the autumn of 1944. And in 1945, over 12,000 arrests took place. By the end of 1949, over 27,000 people had been arrested on political grounds. And about 20,000 had been deported to the Eastern Soviet Union, meaning to the east of the Ural Mountains, and therefore into the Siberian region in March 1949. So presumably people who had cooperated more closely with the German authorities mostly joined the tens of thousands of people who fled from Estonia to the Western democracies, such as Sweden and Canada and the United States, before the advance, or eventually to Canada and the United States, before the advance of the Red Army. So the investigation of arrested persons was in most cases conducted quickly and cursorily so, without closely examining the details during the first post-war years. So according to the investigation practices of that time, the confession of the accused or the testimony of a witness, note the singular, was generally sufficient to prove the guilt of the accused. So domestically, the Soviet Union based the conviction of people on its own criminal code and relevant regulations, and it convicted people in accordance with the section dealing with betrayal of the fatherland, Rodina in Russian, by the way. The Soviet Union used the term war crimes primarily in communication with other countries, for instance, when demanding the extradition of Estonians from Finland who had fought in the Finnish army. So this was purely a case of stigmatizing people, so branding them as criminals. There had been thousands of Estonians, so-called Finland boys or Finnish boys, Suomepoisit, I think in Estonian, who had indeed fought in the Finnish army with the goal of helping Estonia to become free again. And out of them was formed the Erna battalion. There were probably other units as well. The Soviets, after all, had no information whatsoever connecting these people with war crimes. In November 1945, the Communist Party's Central Committee in the Soviet Union adopted two decisions for holding public trials of the major German military leaders and penal institutions. Convictions and executions took place in two waves. At the 7 trials held at the end of 1945 and the beginning of 1946, 84 people were sentenced to death by public hanging. At the 9 trials carried out at the end of 1947, the fate of another 137 people was decided. Subsequent or later trials of accused prisoners of war were held in camera and in connection with the temporary abolition of the death penalty in the Soviet Union 1947 to 1950. 25 years imprisonment in the Gulag prisons, many of which were located in Siberia, by the way, became the prevailing punishment. About 34,000 German prisoners of war were convicted in the Soviet Union in 1949 to 1950. Both German and Russian historians have concluded that these trials were political and propagandistic in nature. In the first 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, from 1991 to 2001, 13,035 citizens of foreign countries, mostly former German prisoners of war, were rehabilitated by Russian military tribunals. So over 3/4 of the more than 15,000 applications submitted for rehabilitation. But for prisoners of war, being placed under investigation meant conviction as a rule. So Stalin passed away after his brutal dictatorship of some 29 years in March 1953, and after a brief power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev, a somewhat more moderate Soviet dictator, took over. So as a part of the so-called thaw or temporary easing of tensions in the US-Soviet relations, hundreds of thousands of previously convicted people were pardoned. And in September 1955, Mr. Khrushchev gave an extensive amnesty to over 50,000 people who had cooperated with the Germans during World War II. So they were released from forced labor camps, and the number of people released from detention centers was much larger than the number of new arrests. So Mr. Khrushchev gave a speech at the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party in 1956, denouncing the abuses of power and the crimes committed during the Stalin era. He also condemned Stalin's personality cult without, however, condemning communism itself. So he basically was saying that Stalin's crimes were that he went too far, but his crimes did not include consolidating communism inside the Soviet Union. Because if he had denounced both Stalin's crimes and the communist system, he might as well have resigned and scheduled free and fair elections in the Soviet Union. He might as well have recalled all the Soviet troops from the Eastern European countries which they were occupying. And he, of course, did not want to do that because that would essentially have meant that admitting that he had worked much of his life in vain for a false ideology, even though that would have been true. So the Cold War entered a new phase, one with contradictory politics. So peaceful coexistence, so in other words, accepting the fact that there were communist and non-communist countries and that they should cooperate with each other and try to resolve their differences without new wars or bloodshed, that became one of the buzzwords of the thaw, as it later became during the so-called détente period of easing tensions at that time between the US, the Soviet Union, and China between about 1969 and 1979. This, however, took place partly at the expense of peoples or nations under the rule of the Soviet Empire, because in 1956 there were riots in both Hungary and Poland. People clearly demonstrated already in those two countries, and there were many others who would have demonstrated if they had dared to, there and elsewhere, against the brutal Soviet-style communist dictatorship. In Poland, this led to the replacement of the hardline Stalinist leaders with a more moderate and nationalist and patriotic communist leader, Mr. Władysław Gomułka, who in turn would be replaced in December 1970 following major riots and demonstrations on the Polish Baltic coast by Edward Gierek. In Hungary, this led to the temporary reinstatement of former Prime Minister Imre Nagy into office in late October 1956. He had earlier served as Prime Minister from 1953 to 1955, had officially had to resign because of his heart attack. But in early November 1956, the Soviet Union brutally crushed the Hungarian Revolution, and this led to the mass exodus of some 200,000 Hungarians to Western Europe and North America mostly. And tragically, later that November, Mr. Nagy, who had taken refuge in the Yugoslav embassy, Yugoslavia, as we remember from our world history courses and other private studies in that time period's history, had since 1948, under its dictator, marshal, and later president, Josip Broz Tito, pursued an independent, non-aligned course. So while it hadn't legalized any opposition parties, it had proved less coercive with its people. It had, for example, allowed a fairly wide freedom of religion and freedom of travel and freedom even to emigrate under the so-called market socialism system. And it had allowed its workers to own their factories and other workplaces. So it was a kind of hybrid regime. Yes, a communist regime, but a fairly capitalist one and fairly open to the rest of the world. So anyway, Mr. Nagy had been there for 2.5 weeks approximately, and then he had been promised a safe passage, but immediately after leaving the embassy had been arrested. And then in 1958, unfortunately and tragically, he was tried secretly for alleged treason against Hungary and the Soviet Union and shot to death. His remains were then reburied after the collapse of the communist regime in Hungary in 1990, I think. And then this, of course, happened later in 1968 when that country's moderate communist dictator, Mr. Alexander Dubček, promoted during the so-called Prague Spring in the course of about 7 months or less, from late January to late August 1968, increased freedoms of speech, expression, and opinion, and even of the press and other mass media without the legalization of any opposition parties. And he even tried to assure in a conference held towards the end of, or at the end of July 1968, the Soviet authorities or diplomats, that he wasn't trying to weaken communism or socialism, he was just trying to humanize them in order to make them more popular and appealing to the Czechoslovaks. But these assurances did not help, and then he, along with many other reform-minded communists, were arrested in late August 1968, and Czechoslovakia again became a hardline communist dictatorship under President and General Secretary Gustav Husak. So to support the weakened Soviet regime, a new framework for mobilizing and orchestrating was needed in place of the personality cult of the late Stalin. The Great Patriotic War, or more broadly the struggle against German occupation in Eastern Europe, became the symbol for uniting the people. The post-World War II generation had emerged in society, and with it, a new treatment of the war and the sufferings of the people was formed in opposition to the attempts of imperialist countries to continue the work of the fascists to destroy the Soviet Union. Imperialist countries was the Soviet code word and communist code word for the United States and its mostly Western democratic allies. So a propaganda campaign was started in May 1957 under the aegis of the German Socialist Unity Party, Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, against West German judges and lawyers who had served Hitler's regime. Interestingly enough, Mr. Khrushchev visited Austria in July 1959, and while visiting a former Nazi concentration camp in Mauthausen, he publicly disclosed that the East German leaders had been instructed at the beginning of 1959 to hurl accusations of Nazism at West Germany. So there was, like in many cases, a grain of truth to these accusations. It was true that, for example, or especially in West Germany and Austria, there were in the 1950s and 1960s, and even in some cases the 1970s and perhaps the 1980s, thousands or hundreds of people in, for example, the civil service and even in politics who were former members of the Nazi Party. Most notably, there were some years in the 1960s when both, so jointly this happened from 1966 to 1969, when both West Germany and Austria had a federal chancellor or prime minister, meaning the head of federal government, who was a former member of the Nazi Party. So the West German federal chancellor to whom I'm referring was Kurt Georg Kiesinger, or Kiesinger, of the Christian Democratic Party, and the Austrian federal chancellor to whom I'm referring is or was Mr. Josef Klaus of the Austrian People's Party. One of the reasons why the denazification did not go as far as it should have gone was the excuse given that otherwise it would have been difficult to find enough qualified people for civil service and politics, and to some extent the economic institutions of both countries. And indeed, quite openly, the late Bruno Kreisky, himself a Jew, albeit an agnostic religiously, who was the leader of the Austrian socialist and social democratic parties from the 1960s to the early 1980s, and served as the Austrian federal chancellor after Mr. Klaus from 1970 to 1983. In some book or in an online source, I read the comment that he basically said that yes, he knew there were former Nazis in the Austrian government and civil service, but he decided to work with them because if denazification had been thorough, then many more people would have had to be fired from their jobs and placed on trial. And of course, the fired people would have had to be replaced by others. And then in both countries, West Germany and Austria, there was a kind of corrupt bargain, if you want to call it that, between those people who knew there were former Nazis in the government, the local, state, and federal governments, and in the civil service locally, at the state level and federally, and then with those who knew there were former Nazis. But under the name of consensus politics, in other words, a broad agreement on the major lines of domestic and foreign policy, in West Germany, the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and then the third major party at the time, the Free Democrats or Liberals, decided to keep it quiet, that these former Nazis were still in the government and in civil service, although by no means always in very prominent roles. And similarly, in Austria, there was that agreement, especially between the center-right and Christian Democratic Austrian People's Party and the center-left Socialist Party, later to be renamed the Social Democratic Party, and to a smaller extent between the then small Freedom Party of Austria, that actually had quite many former Nazis among its ranks. And then there were those who were basically apologists in nuanced ways, rhetorical ways for Nazism, such as the late Dr. Jörg Haider, who served twice as the regional governor of Carinthia or Kärnten, the southernmost federal state of Austria, from 1989 to 1991, and then from 1999 until his tragic death in a car accident in 2008. He was fired as the regional governor of Carinthia in 1991 when he had praised the employment policies of Nazi Germany in a legislative debate in the state legislature against a social democrat who had criticized his requirement that either the people on unemployment insurance or on welfare, probably the people on receiving unemployment insurance, would have to perform some sort of work service, claiming that it resembled that of the Third Reich or Nazi Germany. What did Governor Haider reply? Rather carelessly and in a distorted way, because at the time in 1991, Austria had one of continental Europe's lowest unemployment rates. He claimed, no, it wouldn't be like the Third Reich, because the Third Reich, meaning Nazi Germany, had an effective employment policy which not even your government in Vienna, meaning the Austrian federal government, which at the time was a grand coalition between the Social Democrats and the People's Party, can bring about. And this was simply false. Because Austria, for decades after the Second World War, had had one of the lowest unemployment rates of the democratic Western Europe. Not the least because of that broad consensus politics mainly between the Austrian People's Party and the Socialists or Social Democrats. Although, yes, it did to some extent result in a bloated and inefficient civil service because of the so-called economy based on party cards or Parteibuchschafts. Parteibuchwirtschaft. In other words, the public sector jobs, civil service jobs, were divided up on the basis of the federal parliamentary election results, mostly between the center-right People's Party and the center-left Socialists or Social Democrats. The international situation was critical and the status of divided Germany was not yet unequivocally decided. In his speech, Khrushchev compared the West German Federal Chancellor or Prime Minister Konrad Adenauer to Hitler, which of course was a very unfair comparison because, after all, Mr. Adenauer had opposed Hitler and he had even been fired from his job as the Lord Mayor of Cologne. And warned against West German irredentism, in other words, the desire to recapture the lost territories and the spread of Nazism, as long as ex-Nazis like Theodor Oberländer were part of the government. But we have to remember that there was a strong refugee movement. In other words, these refugees had fled from what had become East Germany, but also from the western regions of Poland and Czechoslovakia. And even for several years, or many years, up to about 1961, they were represented in the West German Bundestag as a political party. And then for electoral reasons, the late Federal Chancellor Adenauer and similar Christian Democratic politicians at least pretended to be sensitive to their claims. And yes, there were a number of road signs in West Germany into never, showing the German borders of 1937. But then this policy was fully abandoned with the election of Social Democrat Willy Brandt, a genuine champion of democracy and human rights and a genuine opponent of Nazism, in October 1969, and his social liberal coalition of the Social Democrats and Free Democrats adopted the so-called Ostpolitik, or peaceful, more peaceful and conciliatory foreign policy towards the Eastern European nations. And no wonder Brandt then visited East Germany and Poland in 1970, and in the latter country he signed a friendship treaty in December 1970, and he then recognized the Oder-Neisse Rivers line as the western border of Poland, of course pending still its final ratification. Most notably, Federal Chancellor Brandt knelt at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, apparently as a spontaneous and sincere demonstration of his deep sorrow for the collective guilt of the German people in having perpetrated to a majority extent the mass murder of European Jews including Polish Jews during the Second World War. At the end of the 1950s began a struggle against expatriate communities of peoples living under Soviet rules, predominantly consisting of people who had fled to the West during World War II. The size and influence of expatriate communities differed widely from ethnic group to ethnic group and from country to country. From the Soviet standpoint, what was taking place in North America, meaning Canada and the United States, was definitely the most important, because the United States was the main ideological enemy, although China would soon follow. And large communities of refugees from the Soviet Union, such as Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Caucasian peoples, meaning Georgians, Armenians, and Azeris, lived there. For Estonia, the activity of its expatriate community in Sweden was undoubtedly also important, because already in 1944, thousands of Estonians had fled across the Baltic Sea to Sweden, although many of them would later immigrate across the North Atlantic, either to Canada or the United States. Of course, a welcome guard on every front imaginable in the fight against communism. The expatriate theme also found its way into the domestic politics of their host countries, not to mention the foreign policy of those countries. In 1959, General Dwight Eisenhower, who was then serving his second and last term as the US president, declared the annual commemoration of a week in support of the captive nations controlled by the Soviet Union. This became an important landmark in the anti-communist struggle of emigrant communities that had fled from Soviet rule. I'm trying to find more relevant paragraphs. The beginning of show trials. A number of common traits characterize the show trials of Nazi criminals that began in 1960 in the Eastern Bloc and especially in the Soviet Union. So the Eastern Bloc refers to the communist countries of Eastern Europe. Of course, the Soviet Union stretched as Russia, its largest former republic, stretches all the way from Eastern Europe in the west to the Asian Far East in the east. But the other communist countries of Eastern Europe were Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria. And out of them, all but Yugoslavia and Albania remained in the Soviet bloc officially until the democratization, at the superficial democratization of Eastern Europe, or partial democratization, and the Soviet Union's disintegration, which took place from 1989 to 1991. Yugoslavia, as I mentioned, since 1948 pursued an independent non-aligned course, and then Albania, whose Stalinist dictator, Mr. Enver Hoxha, who would rule until his death in 1985, believed that the Soviet Union had watered down the Marxist and Stalinist and Leninist principles. Warsaw Pact, a Soviet-led military alliance that had been established in 1955 to oppose the US-led military alliance NATO, which had been established in 1949, and most of whose members are European countries. Most recently, Sweden and Finland applied to join NATO, and we will see when all the 30 existing NATO countries will ratify their membership applications. Turkey is still demanding the extradition of so-called Kurdish terrorists from both Sweden and Finland, by the way. Temporal coordination. The show trial of West German Minister Theodor Oberländer and his conviction in absentia in the German Democratic Republic or East Germany in April 1960 followed Khrushchev's speech in July 1959. Preparations began at practically the same time for show trials in the interior of the Soviet Union and in the annexed territories along its western frontier, the Baltic countries, meaning Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then western Ukraine under Soviet rule, including roughly the entire territory that had been under German occupation, more or less from 1941 to 1944, at least partially. Preparations for the first such trial began in Estonia in May 1960, and then the trial was held from March the 6th to 11th, 1961, 1 month before the Eichmann trial in Israel. Adolf Eichmann, one of the most notorious perpetrators of the Holocaust, had been captured by some Israeli military intelligence agents of the Mossad organization in Buenos Aires, the Argentinian capital, in May 1960, and then flown to Israel. And he would be convicted of crimes against humanity and then executed either at the end of May or at the start of June 1962 in Israel. Before the Eichmann trial in Israel from April the 2nd to August the 14th, 1961, that resonated worldwide. Another 4 similar trials were staged in Estonia in 1961 to 62 and from 1966 to 1967. Trials of this type were held in Latvia, Estonia's southern neighbor, in the Baltic region of northern and eastern Europe from 1961 to 1974. And similar trials were held in Lithuania, the southernmost of the Baltic countries, at the same time. The first such show trial began in Byelorussia, now called Belarus or White Russia, in Eastern Europe, in October 1961, followed by at least 5 trials between 1962 and 1971. Analogous show trials began in the Ukraine in April 1963, followed by another 3 trials in 1966 to 67. Preparations for convicting local collaborators at show trials began in the same way in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in October 1960. And then show trials that included those in Krasnodar in northern Caucasia, and in Stavropol, and then in Leningrad, in Pskov, in Novgorod, and in Orel took place between 1963 and 1978. Then trials in Estonia. In the case of Estonia, 5 Cold War era show trials of war criminals can be cited that illustrate different aspects of this action. First case, Mere Geretsvik. Historical background. Two train loads of Jews, about 2,000 in all, were brought from Czechoslovakia and Germany to Estonia to the Jagala correctional labor camp under the jurisdiction of the German security police and the ST Sicherheitsdienst, or literally security service, basically the secret police or one of its units, although not the notorious Gestapo, Geheime Staatspolizei, or secret state police, in September 1942. Around 400 to 500 younger people were selected from the arrivals and sent to the camp. The remainder were executed on the day of their arrival at the nearby Kaleviliva artillery range. And then among the executioners were camp staff members of Estonian origin. Second case, Juriste Linnas Dix. Okay, finally we can get more detailed information on the alleged war crimes of the late Mr. Karl Linnas. Historical background. In July 1941, the German occupying authorities set up a prison camp in the city of Tartu, which is in southern Estonia, by the way, with the support of the members of the local paramilitary group Omakaitse, or self-defense or self-protection guards. This facility thereafter remained in operation as a correctional labor camp under the jurisdiction of the German security police. The camp also functioned during its first months as an extermination camp, where partially in response to the Red Terror, up to 4,000 local residents were executed. The head of the camp for most of this time was none other than Mr. Karl Linnas, who moved to the United States after World War II. On November the 25th, 1960, the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic's KGB, secret police, initiated criminal proceedings to ascertain and bring to justice the culprits of the executions carried out at the Tartu camp during the years of German occupation. So charges were brought against Mr. Juhan Juriste, the first head of the Tartu concentration camp in the summer of 1941, arrested in Estonia, Ervin Dix, who briefly served in the Tartu concentration camp special department, later served as head of Department 4 of the Estonian Security Police, and then moved to Australia. And Karl Linnas, the second head of the Tartu concentration camp in 1941 to 42, When mass executions took place, he later moved to the United States. All the defendants were sentenced to death at the public trial held on from January the 16th to 20th, 1962. Dix and Linnas, of course, in absentia because they were living in Australia and the United States, respectively, or in that order. Dix, who lived in Australia, was not extradited to the Soviet Union. US authorities revoked Linnas's citizenship in 1981, after which a new campaign started to demand his extradition upon the recommendation of the Estonia Soviet Socialist Republic's KGB. Finally, Linnas was extradited to the Soviet Union in late April 1987. However, he died in a prison hospital in the beginning of July 1987 without being brought to trial again. He died of natural causes. Then third case, Evald Mikson. Historical background: Estonian Forest Brothers operated in Estonia near the Soviet-German front line already in July 1941 in support of the German forces. And then in the initial phase of the German occupation, members of the Omakaitse lynched people accused of perpetrating the Red Terror. After all, Estonia, just like Latvia and Lithuania, had been fully occupied by the Soviet forces in June 1940. The Omakaitse also participated in executions by the German authorities. Evald Mikson was one of the leaders of the local Omakaitse unit in Vennu rural municipality in Tartu county or province in southern Estonia. In the autumn of 1941, he joined the political police in Tallinn, the Estonian capital, yet was himself arrested, apparently accused of appropriating the property of people being held in custody. At the end of the war, he escaped from Estonia and settled in Iceland, which is a small island country in northern Atlantic, but is considered a part of Scandinavia or the northern European or Nordic countries, and therefore of Europe. Then, fourth case, Pärnu's Omakaitse. Pärnu is a spa city in southwestern Estonia on the Baltic Sea's coast. Historical background: much like the previous case, Forest Brothers and Omakaitse units later formed out of them operated in Pärnu county or province from July 1941 onward. The participation of members of the Omakaitse in repressions carried out by the German authorities connects them with several crimes. In March and April 1962, wartime members of the Pärnu Omakaitse Edmund Kuusik, August Reinvald, Julius Vix, and Theodor Kaldre were arrested. Wright and Baldin were repeatedly cited as leading figures by the arrested persons and by witnesses who were questioned. And Kuusik, Reinvald, Vix, and Kaldre were sentenced to death at the trial held from December the 11th to 15th, 1962. And then, fifth case, Lääne County or Lääne Province, Omakaitse and Ago Talvar. Ago Talvar was an organizer of a group of forest brothers in Lääne County in western Estonia in the summer of 1941 and was the head of the Lääne County Omakaitse from August the 31st, 1941 until March the 1st, 1942. After that, serving as head of the Omakaitse headquarters administrative department in Tallinn until the end of the German occupation. Ago Talvar lived in Sweden and was wanted by the KGB starting. The KGB was the notorious Soviet secret police, whose earlier names were GPU and Cheka. Incidentally, the secret police of the Russian Empire had been called Okhrana. From his correspondence with his wife and relatives who remained in the Soviet Union, his whereabouts or location and contact details were ascertained in 1958. In July 1967, four men were on trial: Roland Rudolf Rand, Ants Tinniste, Harry Paisu, and Ago Talvar. Mr. Talvar quite predictably informed the journalist, a Soviet journalist in Sweden, that he refused to participate in the Soviet propaganda exercise. Rand and Tinniste and Talvar in absentia were sentenced to death on July the 13th, 1967. Paisu was declared mentally incompetent and was sent instead to a psychoneurological hospital for coercive treatment. Then let's try to find more. The local public was prepped for the show trial during the preliminary investigation, and voices from among the people demanded the punishment of the accused. And then was mentioned Mr. Jalmar Mäe, who was a far-right Estonian and had served as the head of the Estonia self-administration during the German occupation. He immigrated to Austria after the Second World War. Let's see if there's something further to say. As an example, Karl Linnas, who was mentioned only once in the brochure in the case of the Tartu camp, later became the main figure in the case. Articles about him started appearing in the United States already in May 1961, but it was almost exactly 26 years later, in April 1987, that he finally was extradited to what was then the Soviet Union. But since he died only over 2 months after arriving, after his forced deportation of natural causes, then the trial against him never took place. At the same time, the brochure made graphic accusations against the former policeman Axel Luitsalu, who had emigrated to Canada, although the Soviet security organs themselves later admitted that he had been an official in the criminal police and that no charges could be brought against him. Considering how the Soviet Union treated other people and countries, among them Sweden, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, and the United States, it is hardly likely that political relations with Iceland could have deterred them. People can be convicted and their extradition can take years. Soviet show trials were not hindered by a lack of evidence. For propaganda purposes, it was even more useful if the convicted person was not extradited, because then the issue could be raised repeatedly if it was politically expedient, in other words, advantageous in this case to the Soviet Union and to its communist propaganda machine. And not only the particular criminal, but also the country shielding him could also be accused. So actual crimes formed the background of all the show trials discussed here. Mass murders of local residents of Estonia and of prisoners brought from other countries to Estonian territory. The way that evidence was gathered, however, and its use in show trials cast doubt on the direct connection between the defendants in a particular trial and the events under consideration, thus bringing into question their personal culpability or responsibility. Or guilt, rather, yes. Organization of trials. The Soviet Union Constitution, the Soviet Union's Constitution stipulated that, according to Section 111, the deliberation of cases was public in all of the Soviet Union's judicial bodies to the extent that exceptions are not prescribed or were not prescribed, whereas the defendant was guaranteed the right to defense, which of course was just illusory, since they were going to be convicted in virtually all cases in any case. Section 112 stipulated the independence of judges and that they were subject only to the law, but this, of course, was also a fake guarantee, because in practice the judges were pressured to hand down exactly the sentences that the Soviet communist political leaders wanted them to hand down. Section 117 stipulated that organs of prosecution carried out their functions independently of any local organs, subject only to the Soviet Union's chief public prosecutor, but they were subject to the Soviet government and to its leaders, especially the general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, who during most of the Soviet Union's existence was the country's factual dictator. Let's see. Is there any additional information on Mr. Linnas? Propaganda and extradition. After the conclusion of judicial formalities, such trials took on another life in propaganda, as the Communist Party had decided. The books Inimeset Olge Valvsad, or People Be Watchful, about the executions at Kalevi and 12,000 about the Tartu concentration camp were published. Both books appeared in English translation in 1962, and they were distributed through the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic's State Security Committee's first department abroad until the end of the 1980s. The trials were covered in several other propaganda books and in numerous newspaper articles in Estonia and abroad. At the end of 1958, the newspaper Koduma, or Homeland, began publication to spread propaganda among Estonian expatriates. As decided by the Communist Party, a propaganda documentary film entitled Kalevi Syydistab, or Kalevi Accuses, was made about the Mere Gerretsvik trial. This hackneyed propaganda film is only one example of how cinema, or the movie, was employed to portray the peoples of the Baltic republics as fascists. Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian actors assigned as a rule to play the roles of Nazis became an integral part of countless Soviet war films. Let's see. In terms of demands for extradition, the most noteworthy turned out to be the Karl Linnas case. Which combined the first tug of war between the Soviet Union and the United States, and thereafter the domestic court saga in the United States for extraditing Linnas, the key issue in which was the US citizenship that Linnas had acquired. The Soviet Union had started to demand Linnas's extradition already in November 1961. It made a second attempt in 1962, again unsuccessful. By the end of the 1970s, due to the détente, by the way, the US-Soviet relations had improved somewhat. And changes in the US law in 1978 made it easier to extradite figures like Linnas. The Soviet Union passed some of the materials concerning Linnas to the United States in 1976, thus generating a certain exchange of information. The Soviet side had to prove the authenticity and validity of the evidence that it had provided, that the evidence was actually true, not faked. And this was a heavy onus or burden of proof, given the fact that the Soviet Union was a totalitarian dictatorship where falsification of information was routine. And censorship was very heavy and would continue to be until the reforms of the last Soviet dictator, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was in office from 1985 to 1991. The Soviet side was prepared to receive American representatives in Estonia from October 1980 onward, but they refused to conduct a new preliminary investigation. Charged with providing false information, he concealed or hid his service in a concentration camp on his application form concerning his activities during World War II. Linnas was stripped or deprived of his American citizenship in 1981. This, of course, made him then an alien living in the United States. After that important charge, the Soviet Union presented another demand for his extradition, and against the protests of Linnas, a true propaganda war on both sides began. One of his main counter-arguments was the absence of due process in the Soviet Union. Recall that the verdict handed down in absentia or in absence concerning Linnas was not made by the court. Opposition and various court actions continued for years, becoming part of domestic political arguments in the United States, where at the time the president was Ronald Reagan, a former Democrat turned Republican, and he was very popular for several years of his 8 years in office. And then Democrats, especially the partisan liberal Democrats, were trying to find issues to accuse him and especially his administration's other officials of. After going through all stages of appeal, Linnas was extradited from the United States on April the 24th, 1987, so just over 2 months prior to his death of natural causes, and brought to the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, becoming the first person accused of war crimes to be handed over by the United States to the Soviet Union against his will. Times had changed since the early 1960s, and new trends in Gorbachev's Soviet Union, meaning perestroika or restructuring, glasnost, meaning openness, in other words, the permission to say, to criticize the authorities, and then demokratizatia or democratization. Those were the three buzzwords of Gorbachev's school. And then the so-called New Thinking was the fourth one, apparently influenced this decision. At the same time as the Soviet demand for the extradition of Karl Linnas, the Soviet embassy began a propaganda campaign in Canada and, interestingly enough, in the officially neutral Sweden. Rodionov, the Soviet ambassador to Canada, complained about the activities of Baltic immigrants in Canada and the Canadian federal government's reaction. As a countermeasure, he asked for information on potential war criminals. There actually were none who really fit this description, at least provenly in Canada, very well. But in Sweden, there was Mr. Ago Talvar, who had been sentenced to death in absentia in 1967. When he was brought to Estonia, Linnas was offered the opportunity to submit an appeal for clemency, but on April the 23rd, 1987, he refused to sign any document whatsoever without a lawyer. A defense lawyer was appointed for him in Estonia on April the 28th, so again, just over 2 months before his death. On April the 29th, Linnas submitted his appeal for clemency, in which he referred to the expiration of the court verdict that had been handed down. Then there were options given. The Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic State Prosecutor Karl outlined them. Linnas could have submitted a petition for clemency, which he had done through the only document presented at this point. The second option, according to the prosecutor, was for Linnas to file an appeal concerning his court verdict according to judicial supervisory procedure. Allegedly, the document referred to as Linnas's appeal for clemency essentially amounted to this. Then, as a third option, the review of the court verdict could have been considered, but only in the event that essential new circumstances were found which were not known to the court at the time the verdict was handed down. The fourth option was that a sentence would not be carried out if over 15 years had passed since the verdict was handed down and no new crimes were committed in the meantime. Yet the prosecutor claimed that this kind of situation would most likely give rise to the justified objections of the relatives of the people that had been killed and of the broad masses. The voice of the masses resounded in the form of numerous letters to the editor in the Soviet communist newspaper in Estonia, Rahva Hääl, or the People's Voice. And it was a well-orchestrated mass chorus. On May the 18th, 1987, so just 1.5 months before Linnas's death, the lawyer submitted an application to the court to consider the 1962 court verdict on Linnas as expired due to the long period of time that had passed since then and the fact that steps had not been taken in that period to carry out the sentence. It is not known what discussions took place in the KGB and the court organs regarding this issue. The situation in the Soviet Union in 1987 definitely was not comparable to 1962. The political atmosphere was simmering. It was the peak of Gorbachev's glasnost, and the United States or Sweden would certainly have closely followed new trials. Previously, the Soviets had refused to conduct a new preliminary investigation regarding the Linnas question in response to an inquiry from the United States. A couple of weeks after the appeal was submitted, the detention center disclosed or revealed that Linnas's health had deteriorated and that he was being sent to a medical institution. So Linnas died in Leningrad, currently again renamed St. Petersburg, on July the 2nd, 1987, after an operation in a Minister of Internal Affairs hospital. Instead of the court's death resolved the delicate situation that had developed for the Soviet authorities. So this is the end of the elongated video. I thank you very, very much for your attention, and God bless all of you.